I'm sorry, but you are. I do not want to get involved in politics or anything that, gets me in trouble because it's just not relevant to my point here. My point is the warrior ethos, the warrior spirit is dying. And I'm seeing it dying around me, and I'm getting really tired of it. Okay? The troops I'm trying to train, I'm trying to instill that again. Yes, you may be able to go home tonight to a nice warm bed, have no risk of going to war. What's to say tomorrow everything changes, and all of a sudden, the entire country has to go to war to defend its borders, to defend its people, to defend its interests. Again, politics aside, if there are Canadians dying, or whichever nation you're from, and you're in uniform, and you're willing to protect and to support your nation, you should be willing and ready to do so. And if you're not, it's time to have a real wake-up call. And I'm not preaching to the choir. I could safely say my fitness levels are nowhere near that of which I deployed when I went to Afghanistan. And I need to get back to that, because the more and more I'm seeing coming across the world right now, it's terrifying. And I want to be ready so that if it does kick off, and there is a scenario where I do need to go into a combat situation, or any situation, I'm ready to do so. And I'm doing that for the people I love, my friends, my family, Canadians, other nations, part of NATO. I will be there to do what I have to do. And look, I don't care where you're from. Your own allyship to wherever you're from, your own nation, so be it. But we have to be ready. Now, I know this is very unorthodox. It's not normally like me to have these sort of quote vents or rants, and it's not really a vent or a rant. It's something that I want to try and inject back into those who follow my channel, who I know many of you are feeling very disheartened, very feel like you don't have purpose in your military trade or your, particular army role or whatever armed forces role that you're a part of. You're just not feeling that belonging. What's your purpose? What's your mission, right? We do a lot of training, we do a lot of operations, deployments, ready and training for things. And I know it seems repetitive, boring, whatever it may be to you, and I get it. But look at the longer term picture, okay? Look at the Cold War, years upon years of prepping for nothing actually happening, right? Look at Afghanistan. There wasn't really any prep for Afghanistan. There wasn't really any, let's get ready to go for the next 6 years. 9/11 happened, almost instantaneously after that time, the war in Afghanistan began, right? The war on terror, and many lives were lost during that. And it's really hard for me to listen to people say, oh, well, we're never going to deploy in combat again. Being that I deployed there, know people who have died, have friends who have died there, know of Canadian Armed Force members who have been through the same thing, because of course I deployed with the British, not the Canadian. They also had the perception before Afghanistan of deploying that, yeah, we're just a training force, we'll go to a couple of training bases here and there, we'll do some operations, in peacekeeping, but we won't actually go into a combat environment. Lo and behold, it happened. And it was a fast ramp up to get troops ready for that operational deployment in Afghanistan. Please stop telling yourself that you, as a military member, don't have that purpose. You have a purpose. It may not seem apparent. Be ready so that the next morning when you wake up and you get a phone call, an email, orders, whatever it may be, that something is going to happen or has happened, you have to be ready. And I know it sucks having that perpetual need to be readiness, right? It's like, oh yeah, well, I could be ready for the next 10 years and nothing will happen. So be it. Unfortunately, that's just part of that thankless role of being in the military, is you have to be ready and do a lot of sucky training for if it does happen, but it may never happen. And I'm also not trying to perpetuate war or to perpetuate being someone who needs to go and kill others or, be in that combat environment. No one wants to go into a combat zone, really. But if it happens, I'm ready to go. That's how I tell myself when things are sucky. I'm in that trench, or it's 2 a.m, pouring down rain and everything's drenched. I'm just sick of life. I tell myself, you're doing this for a purpose. And if many of you are doing it for a paycheck or for your schooling or whatever other agenda, or that's your prerogative, and I get it. But please, in the back of your mind, consider that we're here to protect our country, to protect our people. Comes to it, I want to be beside someone in that trench who will fight with me, who will fight alongside me. I want leaders that will do the same, that will take me to battle and use me and utilize me as a tool as necessary. And if I have to lay my life on the line to do so, that's just part of it. I've accepted that many years ago. Okay? I don't care that I have to go do training, and I don't care that I have to continually keep myself upbeat and fit and positive, even though there's nothing but negativity spawning every single day upon our military members today. Everything is against us. Everything, from propaganda to finances to politics, everything is against the modern soldier. But if you have in your heart, you're willing to fight for your country and have that warrior spirit, you're off to a good frickin' start. So please, consider my message as not something that I'm trying to tell you to do, it's consider to do. If you are a warrior at heart, then if shit hits the fan, you're ready to go. I apologize for my language, but sometimes I just have to be real and raw. Be a warrior, be ready to go. It doesn't matter what trade you are, you're all there to support the tip of that spear and whatever's necessary for your nation. So please, consider what I'm trying to say. If you ever want to talk about it, feel free to reach out to me. I know many people are feeling the same way. Many people completely disagree. Again, I'm not trying to fight against you. I'm not trying to disagree with you. I'm just trying to motivate people who feel the same way as I do. Maybe that will drive you into something even bigger of your future and your careers. Because when I'm training my troops, I am forevermore going to be instilling that we have to be ready for war. That is our job. Plain and simple. Thanks for joining me. Let me know in the comment section what you think about my messages today. And I really appreciate you stopping by. Those of you who are serving right now, thank you for what you do. I know we give a thank you for our service kind of thing, but truly, thank you for what you do. Whether you're a supply tech giving stores, or you're an infantryman, you're a gunner, you're an air tech, it doesn't matter what trade or role you are. Thank you for what you do. You've still stood upon the parapet and you are ready to serve your nation regardless of what it is. Even if you hate every second of doing it, you're still doing it. So thank you. I hope you will have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Be ready.
Gunners have been on standby for this fire mission several times over the past few days.
Use the key.
Their mortar rounds kill one of
Get
the
ready for
insurgents.
whatever happens next. We ain't done. Local threats are triggering the security override.
Curse is canceled. The other man escaped temporarily.
This is Kaliningrad, approximately 400 kilometers to the west of the Russian mainland. It's a Russian outpost with pivotal strategic importance. Situated between Lithuania and Poland, and divided from the rest of Russian territory by NATO allied nations, Kaliningrad is a small outcropping of land, easy to miss on the map, but with a few scary tricks up its sleeve. By air, Kaliningrad is close enough to launch nuclear missiles that could quickly reach the capital of every country on the European continent. By sea, Kaliningrad hosts Russia's Baltic Fleet, due to its holding of Russia's only year-round ice-free port on the Baltic Sea. And by land, Kaliningrad holds the keys to one of Russia's primary anti-NATO strategies, something which has played a major role in preventing NATO from fully responding to Russia's geopolitical moves for several decades, including, but not limited to, Russia's several invasions of Ukraine. In some ways, Kaliningrad is, or at least has long been, the ultimate strategic position for Russia. But these days, that strategic position is becoming potentially bad news for them. Increasingly less of an asset and more of a liability. And there is a growing threat that Russia could lose this exclave forever, due in part to the way they've overextended themselves in Ukraine, and also due in part to internal separatist movements that Russia has tried to suppress, but that have become emboldened by the hardships of war, with fears that were once mere murmurs, quickly turning into very loud voices. Right now in Kaliningrad, there is a rapidly growing movement known as the Baltic Republican Party, a separatist group whose leader has recently stated that he believes the moment has come for the region to declare its independence from Russia and side with Europe against Putin. And he's not alone. A recent referendum covering 1/5 of the residents living within the Kaliningrad Oblast had 72% of the participating voters express a desire to leave Russia. And while this doesn't mean that 72% of all the people within Kaliningrad want to secede, since those who participated in this referendum may already have been more inclined in a separatist direction, it still demonstrates that for Vladimir Putin, there are a worryingly large number of the 500,000 or so Russians within the region that aren't as loyal to him as he may like to believe. So much so that nearly 70,000 of them were willing to go so far as to risk their lives and their freedom by putting their names on a ballot to secede from the nation in the middle of an active war. Many more separatists are almost certainly hiding behind the curtains, and the growing tensions have made Russia very nervous, to say the least, with predictable crackdowns on journalists and those expressing views contrary to the Kremlin's wishes often being arrested and labeled as foreign agents. But as these internal forces continue to grow, at the same time as new external forces come to bear against Russia as a result of the war in Ukraine, it's becoming increasingly possible that Russia could lose Kaliningrad in our lifetimes, or even sooner than we think. If that happens, it will certainly shape Russia's future, and not just Russia's future, but the future of Europe, America, and many other far-reaching corners of the world. But to really understand the full scale of that impact, you first need to understand how Kaliningrad has shaped Russia's recent past. It's a side of the war in Ukraine that most people haven't seen, far from the front lines, but a side that could, eventually, become the most impactful front of them all. To explain it all, we have to go back to the beginning. Just 70 days following its invasion of Ukraine, Russia found itself in dire need of the Kaliningrad exclave. What had initially been planned as a brief blitzkrieg attack had failed, and Russia's frontline troops, which had expected a quick knockout victory, had instead found themselves in full retreat in several key regions, including Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy, with other regions at major risk, since Russia had not yet had time to build sufficient fortifications to sustain itself against the large, rapid counteroffensive. At this point, Russia faced a very major threat. If other European nations made the decision to retaliate in a meaningful way while Russia was still vulnerable and on its back foot, the entire situation could crumble in a matter of days or weeks, and the Ukraine invasion misadventure would land itself as a brief, embarrassing blot on the Russian record. As the United States and Europe watched the situation on the ground and debated what to do, Russia wasted no time and turned to what was perhaps the strongest weapon in their anti-NATO arsenal: Kaliningrad, a weapon they had used over the decades to pacify European and American resistance as Russia carried out their expansionist plans to reconquer pieces of the old Soviet Union. This weapon was in and of itself part of the old Soviet Union, and had long allowed Russia to defeat NATO in the only way they knew how, by convincing them to stay out of the fight. In May of 2022, with its army close to full retreat, Russia conducted a provocative military exercise from the Kaliningrad exclave, simulating a situation where they would fire nuclear rockets all across Europe, using some of the same ballistic missile systems that were being used against Ukraine, and showing that, as long as Russia controlled Kaliningrad, NATO was well within range. This came in concert with foreboding threats from the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin had said just a few days earlier that if anyone intended to intervene from the outside, they should know that Russia's retaliatory strikes would be lightning fast, that Russia had the tools they needed for this and would use them if necessary. The message was clear. NATO had better not intervene against Russia's retreating troops, or else nukes from Kaliningrad. But while these big words might have sounded scary to the untrained ear, one needs to consider that the real goal of these nuclear exercises was probably different than what might first appear on the surface. A well-kept secret about nuclear saber-rattling is that nuclear threats are not generally done to scare national leaders or military forces, at least not directly, but rather to scare the civilian populations of an opposing nation into apathy. Because, while it's sad to say, most politicians fear being voted out by a scared populace, far more than they fear the use of a nuclear missile against some distant city they aren't connected to, especially since the nuclear scenario isn't at all likely, while potentially getting voted out of office is. Nuclear threats are a way to feed talking points to the media of your opponents, and to get people to write letters to their congressmen, so to speak. As such, They play an effective role in influencing long-term political decisions, especially around election seasons, where the goal is to get someone in office who the opposing nation feels is a stronger leader against nuclear threats, but whose foreign policy may actually be more in your favor. Someone who is willing to appease you to remove fear from their constituents, rather than holding you accountable and calling your bluff, for example. But in situations where the rubber meets the road, and national leaders are facing an immediate on-the-ground crisis, or a critically important threat, nuclear saber-rattling wouldn't be expected to be nearly as impactful. That's because people in decision-making positions are already well aware of the nuclear threat, and have already calculated it into their strategies, so nuclear saber-rattling doesn't add any new information. Plus, these leaders have also seen countless examples of nuclear saber-rattling in the past, seemingly every week from nations like North Korea, or previously when the West fought in on-the-ground proxy wars against the Soviet Union. But in spite of all of these threats, nothing has ever happened. This makes experienced leaders generally dispositioned to understand better than most that nuclear threats are almost certainly not real. And when weighing the near certainty of a geopolitical loss, such as ceding Ukraine to Russia, against the very, very low probability of real nuclear retaliation in response to their intervention, most leaders would move to take their chances and avoid the near certain loss. At least, this is certainly what has always been done in the past. For example, right or wrong, the West took its chances with nuclear warfare by intervening in Russia's efforts to influence Korea and Vietnam. And Russia didn't respond with nukes then, even under the leadership of some of the most bloodthirsty despots in human history, such as Joseph Stalin during the Korean War. A man who had more than 1 million of his own citizens executed, but still wasn't willing to use nukes against the United States. So if Russia wasn't willing to use nukes when the US intervened in their affairs then, they would not be at all likely to respond with nuclear warfare now if the West engaged in similar intervention in Ukraine. People afraid of Russia's nukes due to the Ukraine conflict simply forget that this is not by any means the first time the West has engaged in an armed conflict with a nuclear-armed Russian state. For these reasons, and more, nuclear saber-rattling on its own gives leaders no reason to do anything differently than they already are, or in other words, no reason to stop an attack that they may already be inclined to pursue, such as, in our example, potential reinforcement of Ukraine against a retreating Russian army, which Putin was genuinely worried about. But if even your nuclear threats aren't enough, what's a raging despot supposed to do to hold back his potential enemies? In this case, if he really wanted to deter NATO, Putin had to go beyond a nuclear threat, to include something more realistic that would be taken more seriously by the real decision makers, even if it went unnoticed by the media headlines. To do so, Putin chose to threaten the West with a type of weapon that he had already recently used, rather than one he would only use in theory. If nukes could scare Western populations, great. But to give immediate pause to Western leaders, he would focus not on the nuclear drills alone, but also on the drill's location. The goal was to remind Western leaders, not primarily about the fact that Russia had nukes, but rather about the fact that Russia had Kaliningrad. For seasoned military commanders, the Kaliningrad reminder was something that was much more impactful than the nuclear threat, because nobody ever has forgotten that Russia has nukes. But many people routinely forget, underestimate, or don't even know in the first place the strategic importance of Russia's Baltic Sea exclave. Kaliningrad itself is strategic, not primarily because of the nuclear missiles, but instead because of something called the Suwalki Gap, which, according to many military analysts, is by far NATO's weakest point, and has even been called the single deadliest place on the planet. The Suwalki Gap refers to the small strip of land on the Polish and Lithuanian border separating Russian Kaliningrad from Belarus. This is a mere 70-kilometer strip that is bordered by Russia and Russia's closest ally, and its danger should not be understated. In the event that Russia ever engaged in an armed conflict with NATO, passing this stretch of land would be required for Western ground troops to reinforce the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia from a Russian invasion, something they would be required to do based on their Article 5 commitments. But doing so would be the definition of a meat grinder, because the entire strip of land could be heavily fortified by Russia in a short amount of time. and easily reached by artillery and missiles coming from both Russian and Belarusian territory.